Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes with our Dominator, Mister Eclipse, who's level 32 now. We've got Midnight Grasp, and we have upgraded our enhancements. So we have all plus threes, except for the inventions, which are obviously whatever level they were created at. So some are plus three, some are minus two. It doesn't really matter. So we've got everything buffed up, and we're in pretty good shape. And we have Midnight Grasp, which is a melee power. So we now have two melee things. I've got, kind of attacked a couple times and had some issues, but we've done okay. I've gone back down to +0, guys, and the reason for that is, man, the Devouring Earth. We're just kicking my butt. So I managed to survive it, but there were a lot. It took me a really long time. The problem is that when you get the +1 missions, you get +2 enemies, and the +2 enemies, like, I'm just missing constantly, and missing with a hold, missing with the heal, missing with another hold or a possess, and it's just like miss, hit, miss, 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 and then they're on me and they're, you know, mezzing me and stuff like that, and it's just not really enjoyable. So I don't know why I'm going this way. I set us back to +0. We're doing Jenny Firkins, and she just started me on the Unity Plague, so I figured I'd bring you guys back. So let's go to Steel Canyon, and as we do, we're going to talk about 5 things that players hate DMs to do. So I found this video. It's a guy with a fairly small channel. I can't remember his name now. I do apologize. He has about 8,000 subscribers, so I don't know how big his poll was, but he apparently did a poll of his subscribers and asked them. I think he did a poll. I don't think he was reporting another poll. Asked them what are things that would make you actually nope out of a campaign, right? Just quit the campaign entirely. And he's got a video called 5 Things That Players Hate It When DMs Do, or something like that. Let's see if I can check the exact things players hate about DMs. And we're going to go over them and talk about them. And although I don't necessarily disagree with these as kind of peeves, I do think that um, this is very player-centric list. And I think that sometimes players don't understand what the GM's role is and what the GM is trying to do. And a lot of players are very self-centered, and they're only thinking about themselves and their own character and not about the good of the game. And they don't recognize that sometimes the GM is thinking about the good of the game. Now, obviously, there are bad GMs. I've talked about the bad Rob. We're going to mention him in this countdown. But let's go ahead and do it, and we'll talk about it. So number 5, 7% of players say they have left or would leave a game due to this. Number 5 is not admitting you're wrong. So when the GM won't admit that they're wrong about a rule interpretation or they're wrong about something like that, so the player says to the GM in Champions that when a flying character gets hit with knockback, they're they take 1d6 of extra knockback. In other words, instead of rolling 2d6 for the knockback, you roll 1d6. You subtract that from the body done. So in Champions, if you did 10 body and you rolled 7 on the knockback, you'd go back 3 inches, right? So you roll 2d6. So on average, you're going to basically subtract 7 from the knockback. If you're in the air, you roll 1 fewer die 6. You roll 1d6 with a normal attack, and so you'd probably only subtract 3 inches. So a 10 body attack on somebody standing on the ground, on average, will push him back 3 inches. On a flying character, on average, it will push him back 7 inches. If the GM says no, 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 it's 2d6 for both, well, they're wrong. The rules clearly state you subtract 1d6 from the knockback roll when you're rolling to see how much knockback you do with a flying character, right? So I can definitely understand that it could be very frustrating, and I agree. If as a GM, if I find out I'm wrong about the way a rule works, I will admit it. If we go back to the knockback, right? I don't know where we got this, right? Somehow we misinterpreted, or maybe it wasn't written down in the original rules, but they changed it in 4th edition or 3rd edition of Champions or something. But I remember that the way we had always played it in my group was that when you're flying, right? When your character is flying, hovering in the air, let's do it. Let's teleport up here. You're in the air, you're flying up here, right? When you get hit with knockback, if you go back a positive number of squares, or if it's even 0, 0 is you're knocked down, right? And then 1 or more inches is you go backwards, 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, bam, right? Always if you hit something, you crash into it, period. But the rule on general knockback says that if you don't hit anything, if you're hit here and you go back 1, 2, 3, 4, right? You fall to the ground. You are basically prone. You're at half DCV, which is defensive combat value, which means you're not dodging as well until you are able to get up, right? Unless you have the acrobatics skill, which allows you to make an acrobatics roll, which would let you sort of somersault and land on your feet, right? Do a handspring or whatever. I don't think in the original rules, but I may be wrong, that it said anything specific about flight when you go backwards. But since the rule on knockback, the general rule was that if you go backwards and you don't hit something, you end up prone. We ruled that the same thing happened upon when you were flying, right? That you would fall out of the air and hit the ground. And so we thought that was a little bit silly. So what we said was we made a house rule that you can make a dex roll to stay in the air and not fall to the ground. Okay. So then this new guy, his name was Leonard, started playing with us, and he was a young guy. He was a couple years younger than I was. He was still like a sophomore in high school or something. We were seniors, and he read the rules. And in whichever book we were using, he said, that's not what it's supposed to be. He said it actually says in the rules that if you're flying, you go backwards and you kind of end up spinning in the air and you're like floating. Basically, you're hovering now. Unless the damage knocks you unconscious and you fall to the ground or something like that because your flight gets turned off, you stay in the air. You don't have to make a dex roll to stay in the air. And you don't fall to the ground. You just go backwards and you basically stay floating in the air, kind of spinning in place. And you're still like at half DCV, the equivalent of prone, I think. I would have to look this up because we never played it that way. And I said, no, you're wrong. It doesn't work that way. And he pulled out the rule book and showed me where it was. And I was like, oh, okay. All right. So I admitted I was wrong. And I thought about it as a GM. And I said, you know what? And I still think to this day, I think it's a stupid rule that you're floating in the air and prone. You're prone hovered. Like you're hovering, but you're prone. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's their way of kind of making it work the same way whether you're in the air or on the ground. I think it's artificial and strange. And I actually prefer our rule that if you make a free dex roll, because in Champions, when the GM asks you to make a roll, it takes no time. You can make a free dex roll to stay in the air. And if you fail the dex roll, you fall down. Now, if you're really high in the air, you're just going to be falling because you fall at a certain rate per segment in Champions. But if you're only a couple inches above the ground, you're just going to hit. And you take the half damage that you take for going backwards and hitting the ground, which is the normal way. So that became a house rule, right? But I realized after he explained it and showed me in the rules that we had been doing it technically against what the rules say for many years. And it wasn't just me, all of us were doing it that way, right? So I don't know where we got that original rule. We all decided we liked that rule better, and so we stuck with it. But it is a mark of a good GM that when a player shows you the spot in the rule book where you were mistaken, you say, okay, I made a mistake. Now, we're not talking about house rules, right? If you're allowed to make whatever house rules you want, but as my English teacher used to say when we talked about poetry and stuff, or we talked about writing, she used to say, it's perfectly okay to break the rules, but you need to know what they are first, right? And know why you're breaking them, right? Break them for a reason, fine. Breaking them because you don't know the rules is not fine. And it's the same thing here. Right? If you know the rule is that you're hovering in the air and you say, well, I don't like that rule, it's unrealistic, we're going to change it, that's fine. You can do that, but you should know what the rules are. And don't say that you're right when you're wrong. So not admitting you're wrong, I totally agree, is quite annoying. GMs should always admit if they were wrong, right? When you made a mistake, you admit it, you own up to it, and I've done it many, many times, right? There was a number of times in Savage Worlds even, because although I'm pretty good at it and I played it a lot now, I am, so you have to find researchers, let's just check these guys. I am more than willing to admit that there have been a number of times when I've interpreted something incorrectly. And for instance, my best friend, like somebody got stunned, and I said, "Oh, this is what happened with stunned." And my best friend was like, "Doesn't it also include this and this?" I'm like, "No, it doesn't." And he said, "Yeah, it does." And I said, "Well, I've opened up the book. I had the book physically here." I was like, "Well, I read it out to him. I showed it to him." And he said, "Well, that's not what it says in my PDF." And I looked in my PDF, and I'm like, "Yeah, it says this in my PDF." He's like, "Well, not in mine." And we looked in Foundry, and it matched what he was saying. And I'm like, "Wait a minute, I'm looking at the wrong PDF." They updated Savage Worlds. They reprinted in the 20th anniversary reprint. They made some errata changes, and one of them was that they had forgotten to put one of the effects or something into stunned in the core book, and so they had fixed it. And so I don't remember if it was it makes you vulnerable, distracted, whatever. One of them wasn't listed in there, and so I was like, "Okay, you're wrong. We'll play it the way it says in the rules." Right. So I'm always I'm like, I'm not happy to be wrong and be corrected, but I'm always happy to make changes to how we're doing things to follow the rules if I've been incorrect. I don't mind being told I was wrong. You can see what happens. All those misses, you can die from that. Oh, and I just went down. That's bad. Oh man, I can't go anywhere because they're all over the place. Let's see if we can pull them down. This teleport has been a lifesaver a couple times when it works, but you see it just missed. One of them, I guess one of them just got killed by one of the others. I don't want to move too far because I don't want to get killed. Let's see, let's go over here. Maybe I can see what they're doing up there. Let's teleport up. And I might be able to get these guys. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. So that's number one. See, another knockdown. They have so much mez, these guys. Every one of their attacks mezzes. I remember my friends who were controllers and blasters and stuff hating the Devouring Earth because of all the mez. And I always ignored it because, like, I'm a scrapper. I'm immune. Number 4. 8% of players said they have left or would leave a campaign due to this. This one is going to take a while. This is going to be kind of ranty. Rules restrictions. Hyper restrictive or completely arbitrary rules. People feel like they don't have choices that should be part of the game. They're also not fans of, quote, "I don't like this" as a reason, which they consider arbitrary. Right. So this is the old standby of players like options. And therefore, they want the GM to let them have all the options. Right. Here's the problem. Let's see, there's 2 problems. So first of all, they want all the options to be available, and they don't like it when the options are restricted. But here's the problem. Am I going to die here? Look at this. See? Here's the problem with that. A lot of role-playing games have optional rules. So for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, most people like feats. But feats in 5th edition D&D are optional. A lot of people like multi-classing. But multi-classing in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is optional. Notice how I just missed both Rubbles with that Immobilize. And they are a mere +1 to me, but it's just constant missing. So multi-classing is also optional in 5th edition. But there are lots of players who consider both multi-classing and feats not to be optional, but to be must-haves. They, quote-unquote, should be in the game. My best friend is like this. If it's a character class in a rulebook in D&D, he doesn't care which one, you should allow it. So even if you're not playing in the astral plane where the astral elves are shown in that book, he wants you to let him play an astral elf in Ravenloft. Because it's in the book, you should allow it. There's no reason not to. If it's there, it exists. It must be balanced automatically. The idea that it wouldn't be balanced is completely inconceivable to him, apparently, except for sorcerers, his class, which he thinks is so unbalanced, he had to power it up. So my point is this: like, the option is there, they want it. However, optional rules are not must-haves, and it's perfectly okay for a GM to say, I don't want to play with the optional rules. They're optional. And we can think back to a great example of the one DM for D&D 5th edition. And I remember I told this story before because I think I told it with Quintessence last. And I think I also might have repeated it when I was playing the Let's Rants with my Stalker. But this was a new DM who was playing for a bunch of players who were fairly experienced, but they were all too darn lazy to run the game themselves. So she said, I'll DM, but I'm new. And because I'm new, she said, we're not going to use the optional character creation rules. No feats, no multiclassing, because I don't want to get into that, right? And her players actually told her, you're a bad GM for putting these restrictions on us. This is what should be in the game. It's in the player's handbook. You have to allow it. You should allow it. That's what they said to her, right? So I can understand players saying unreasonable restrictions should not be, that they don't like that. However, that is not an unreasonable restriction. It is entirely reasonable and understandable that a brand new GM would want to simplify the game, double misses, would want to simplify the game, another miss, so that it's easier for them to run. And I think players who say you're being unreasonable to simplify the game so it's easier for you as a new GM to run are being ridiculous. So I understand why you want the things that are in the rulebook, but this is one of the reasons why I've said that D&D is problematic for GMs. If it's in the rulebook, even if it says it's optional or it's only for this setting, there are players who are going to want it, right? And they're going to complain if you say no. They're going to call it a restriction, even though all you're doing is following what it says in the rules and saying this is optional, and therefore we're not going to use it, right? So that's one of the issues I have, that players think that everything in the rules should be allowed. Champions, why aren't you allowing extra dimensional movement into the past? Because it's a mess, and I don't want to mess up my universe, right? There are good reasons why we don't want to allow some things. East Texas University, my best friend, when we were talking about the possible campaigns we could play, I didn't pitch Deadlands first because I didn't think he would like Deadlands. I didn't think he liked cowboys and the Wild West and stuff like that. Turns out he was fine with it because he had a character concept that was kind of like a gunslinger / sorcerer, which is perfect for hexslingers, right? When I told him about hucksters and hexslingers, he was like salivating. Okay, this is exactly the character concept I wanted. I didn't know how I was going to get it to play it in D&D because it doesn't fit any of the D&D settings, so he wasn't sure he was ever going to get to play it in D&D. But it's perfect for Deadlands. So I was surprised. But before we did that, I actually pitched East Texas University. I love the East Texas University setting. I think it's really cool. But I didn't think my best friend would like that either. I thought some of the other players might like it. As I pitched these settings, my best friend said, I think my first choice would be ETU. I was like, really? He said, yeah, why? I said, I'm surprised. He said, well, it's like modern horror, whatever, that's fine. I said, yeah, but I'm surprised that you'd want to play college students. And I pointed out that in the ETU rules, it specifically says players cannot take the arcane backgrounds. They cannot have powers. They can cast ritual spells under very restrictive circumstances, but it's important to keep them as normal college students as you can, because otherwise they will be wildly overpowered for the where am I going here? Down, I think. They'll be wildly overpowered for the setting. As soon as he found out no powers allowed, he was like, nah, I don't want to play it. He didn't like that. I don't like that restriction. The restriction is set by the game company and is there because having arcane backgrounds, innate powers, is not germane to the setting. Okay? But it's restrictions. I want everything in the rule book. This is my best friend. I want everything in the rule book to be available. If it all powers, all gear, all everything, right? Think about how he had a wish list for the Dungeon Master's Guide for the all the magic items. He looked through the Dungeon Master's Guide and said, I'm going to decide what magic items I want my character to have. And then he wanted me to give them to him. Every magic item in the game is literally optional, because it's up to the GM to decide what magic items, if any, are put in the game. Not giving him his magic items, I think he felt was an unreasonable restriction. It's part of my build. And I actually had, and I talked about this, one of my guild leaders from the Daybreak Initiative say the same thing, arguing that the magic items are part of your build. Just like enhancements in City of Heroes, and you should allow the players' characters access to any and all magic items they say they want, as long as it's not unreasonable. Like she agreed, you don't give a first level paladin a Holy Avenger. Look at that. You see all the misses on a rubble? You don't give a +5 Holy Avenger to a first level paladin, but if the paladin has it in his build, you should eventually provide it. And you should provide it, like, not the day they retire, but early enough that they can actually use it. And not doing so would be considered, quote unquote, a restriction, right? So these are things where, I don't think that just because it's a possible option in the rulebook that the GM always has to allow it. And think about how, and one of the things my best friend wanted, we'll just do a little Midnight Grasp there, was magic item shops. He argued, oh, they did it on Critical Role, well, it's fine, it didn't break anything. Right? He wanted a magic item shop so that he could pick out the items he wanted. And I think what he wanted was a magic item shop that basically had every magic item other than like artifacts and stuff in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and just let him buy whatever he wants. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Dungeon Master's Guide that you should do that. So now he's got his own little homebrew idea, and if I don't do that, I'm restricting it. So this is how it becomes sort of like a slippery slope, guys. And it's not the case that just because the DM doesn't want to use things that are in the rules, that's unreasonable. And let's get to the second reason, which is, oh, things are arbitrary, and they don't like when it's arbitrary. Well, I suspect that it's almost never arbitrary. My restrictions are almost never arbitrary. So, for example, in the Rome game, I did not allow the reptilian races. You could not play Dragonborn. I didn't say they weren't allowed. I just said, here are the races you can play. And I gave them a list of the races that they were allowed to play, and Dragonborn, Lizard Folk, and Yuan-Ti were not on the list. Why? Because those races were part of the campaign. They were part of the mystery. Why were the Dragonborn missing? They were gone. They didn't even know Dragonborn had existed in this world. They weren't supposed to until they started finding out about them and finding out they had different gods than the Romans had. And oh, look, this is the whole reason for everything that's happening on a cosmic scale. The Romans extincted the Dragonborn, and one of them was imprisoned in an eternal prison and broke out and was a revenant, an undead, whose enemy, whose vow to be killed, that he wanted to kill, was the Roman Empire. And he was trying to take down the Roman Empire. And that was the plot. And I couldn't have that plot with an extinct race if you're playing a member of the race. And because, as I worked out the origin, I decided that this was going to be almost like a metaphor for the extinction of the dinosaurs and the mammals taking over, the warm bloods against the cold bloods, like the Hatfields against the McCoys, and therefore all the reptilian races had to be gone and not playable, because otherwise then you can't have the warm bloods against the cold bloods, right? So, I'm sure, because I couldn't explain to my players why you see all the missing, and you can die from it. I couldn't explain to my players why, because my players would then know the secrets of the campaign. right? It's spoilers. And I didn't want them to be, I didn't want the plot to be spoiled. It was a mystery they were supposed to be discovering. And if I tell them you can't play Dragonborn because they're going to be the enemies in the campaign, that ruins the mystery. So some of this is a lack of trust. And I think, you know, I mean, we can speculate on why that is, but some of this is simply a lack of trust, and the players think that the GM is being arbitrary because they don't know his reasons. But the GM usually does have reasons, just like I did, right? And originally I was going to make the race that had been extincted the elves, and I would have then say you can't play an elf. But I thought two things. First of all, because then the elves are going to be the drow, right? And then the dark elves are going to be enemies. I thought it's just super obvious, kind of cliche. They're always the bad guys, right? Or almost always, because they're cool. And so, but the second one was if I say you can't play elves, they're going to know the elves are the enemies, right? Like before the campaign begins, because why else would you say you can't play elves, except for the fact that the elves have to be the guys that were driven extinct by the Romans, right? And my best friend knows I love elves, so if I say you can't play elves, he's got to know something's up, right? Spoilers. So I was trying not to spoil the story, and I was trying to come up with something relatively interesting and original and so forth, so that my players would enjoy it, and we weren't just sort of doing a generic campaign. But in order to do that, I had to keep some secrets from them. And so sometimes when the GM sets up a rule, the GM has set that rule up for reasons that are story based, and but he can't, because it's story based, he can't necessarily always tell you, right? And so I think a lot of times players think the restriction is arbitrary, and it's really not. Now, sometimes GMs just don't like something, and it's probably not arbitrary. There probably is a reason, right? Like, I don't like extra dimensional movement, and I always complain about it. I hate the time travel ability. I think it's just not something you should give players access to, right? And to such a degree, I dislike that kind of thing that in Savage Worlds, the Wish spell in Pathfinder for Savage Worlds and Fantasy Companion, the Wish spell allows you to travel in time, and the game effect of it is that you can travel back up to like a round or something and play the whole round over. And I was just like, no, that is disallowed. Now I have a reason for it. I am not freaking rerunning a whole combat round, right? That, like, trying to remember who was wounded when and where people went and erase it. There is no way we're going to remember how to do that. We're going to remember all the moves in a battle, especially if there's like 8 on 4 or something like that. People who were knocked out become conscious. Fatigue gets removed. Wait a minute, did you have 1 fatigue or 2 fatigue? Like, no, it's just so much ridiculous record keeping. I'm not allowing that. So I just said that's disallowed. It's too much record keeping. We're not doing that. Most of my friends, nobody complained about that. Everybody's okay with it, right? Some game masters put restrictions on resurrection, that you can't just cast it. You have to do some kind of almost like a skill challenge to get it to work, to convince the dead person to come back to life because they've moved on into the afterlife. I think they even do this on Critical Role, right? And they didn't invent it, right? Lots of GMs have done that in the past. And my point is that that's a restriction on that power. But it's there because the GM isn't being, not because the GM is being arbitrary, but because the GM thinks that the way the power is written doesn't make sense and wants to make it unique and interesting for their world. So a lot of these things are not arbitrary. They're done for a reason, and the GM simply sometimes can't tell you the reason because it may ruin the adventure for you, That's why, just like I couldn't tell my friends the reason why they couldn't play Dragonborn. Right? There was a reason, a really good reason, a story-based reason. But I couldn't tell them that, or I would have ruined the whole mystery of the campaign. All right, we got a boss here. And we're almost ready to dominate, so what we're going to do is summon our pet. We're going to summon the other pets, and we're going to throw a hold on him, dominate, and then we'll throw another hold on him, and we should be okay. That wolf takes way too much time to posture in battle. Just go attack. Stop howling. I know the howl is part of his attack. Alright, so that's number 4. I think that I completely agree that arbitrary general restrictions just for the sake of being restrictions are not something that GMs need to do. But I think that players are so obsessed with the quote-unquote options that it is a bit ridiculous, and it's over the top, right? They want to be able to do anything it says in the rulebook. I want to be able to play my Strixhaven character in Witchlight. I want to be able to play my Witchlight character in Ravenloft. I want to be able to use spells from Strixhaven in Tyranny of Dragons. Well, that wasn't necessarily even what the writers of the game intended you to do. These things are all optional rules. If they're not in the basic rules, if they're not in the player's handbook or the basic rules, they're optional, right? They present these things as optional. The GM is under no obligation to make the optional rules mandatory or required, right? Like, they're optional rules. Let's stop here and get to number 3. So the third, so 8% of people would leave a campaign for rules restrictions. Number 3, 15% of people said they have left or would leave a game due to inflexibility or railroading. They don't like it if the GM can't bend and flex to allow the players to follow the clues in their own way. Right? This doesn't mean linear adventures, he said. People were clear. They meant not being willing to be flexible. Although apparently they did say that there's a little bit of they understand if it's a new GM how you might not be able to be flexible because you don't know what you're doing yet, but that experienced GMs should be willing to be flexible with how they solve things and stuff. So great example of this would be in Savage Worlds, in Deadlands. Stop it. In Deadlands, in the horror at Headstone Hill, the guys who wrote the module were kind of stupid. And you need 2 things to open a safe. You need a combination and a special key. And they left the combination with the people who they want the player characters to have to meet and find. And they left the combination in the guy's house. So the players have the combination, but they need to go to somebody else to get, or they have the key, but they need to go to somebody else to get the combination. The problem with this is there's a spell called object reading. So my players went to the safe with the key. When they found out they needed a combination in addition to the key, they just did object reading and watched back in time and saw what the combination was. And I'm like, well, this cuts out like 2 whole episodes of Act 2. Or Act 1, one of the acts. I can't remember. I guess Act 1. It cut out like 3 or 4 pages of text worth of the adventure. They were supposed to go and meet a gang. This would have gotten them involved in the gang wars in the 3 gangs in Uinta County. And the gang was run by a guy who is hunted by a werewolf, and there was supposed to be a battle with the werewolf, and he was supposed to tell them, I'll give you the combination if you help us with the werewolf. And they were supposed to help fight the werewolf and then potentially befriend the gang and maybe make some allies with the gang. They don't even know this gang exists because they didn't have to go hunting for the combination because they just did object reading, right? So that was them coming up with an alternate solution, and okay, well, that's what happens. They're gonna miss a whole bunch of whole chunk of the adventure. That's up to them. They are the ones who want to do object reading, so that they can do that if they want. So railroading would be me finding some lame reason why object reading doesn't work, because I want them to have to go to these guys and get the combo, right? To do what it says in the rule, in the scenario, right? I didn't do that. I just, okay, we'll let them do it, right? They went wandering into the forest way earlier than they were supposed to. Again, railroading would be to stop them. You can't go into the forest. There's an invisible wall, or some law enforcement guy comes up and says you can't go in there now, or whatever. Or me just as a GM say you can't go in there now, or any other number of ways that I prevent them from going into the forest because it's not time yet, right? So I understand that. That's railroading. You shouldn't do that. You should let the players attempt to come up with whatever whatever things they want. And so, their solutions aren't necessarily going to work, but they should have the option to try them, right? What is it? I think Matt Mercer, when in Critical Role, when his players ask if they could do something, he says, we can certainly try. Doesn't mean it's going to succeed, but you can try to do anything you want, right? And then we'll come up with some odds, what you have to do, make a roll -2 or whatever, and if you succeed at it, then I guess it's going to happen, right? And so that's what they mean by not wanting to be railroaded. They want to be allowed to try things that weren't anticipated by the writer of the adventure, whether that writer of the adventure is the GM or an author at Pinnacle or Wizards of the Coast or what have you. So I agree with that. You shouldn't be inflexible. Number 2, 20% said they would leave or have left games due to this, what this guy called the wrong hat problem. DMs wear multiple hats, he said. Adventure designer, referee of a game session, player of their own PCs in other sessions, players of NPCs, husband, wife, or best friend to somebody else in the group. At the session, you need to be a referee, not the designer of the adventure or somebody's husband or wife. This is a great example of the bad Rob, right? He wore the wrong hat. His adventures as GM were always starring his characters, his player characters, right? He couldn't stop being the player of his characters long enough to be an impartial GM for us. And it made him a bad GM. So it's interesting that this one was much higher in terms of the number of people who said they would leave a campaign, right? It was triple the number of people who would leave a campaign because of restrictions. It was just about double, more than double. It was triple the number of people who said they would leave a campaign because the GM won't admit he's wrong. And it was about a third higher than the number of people who said they would leave a campaign because the GM was being inflexible or railroading. Many more people said they would leave a campaign because the GM is wearing too many hats. That they've left campaigns because the GM is like giving all the magic items to his wife or letting his best friend break the rules or what have you. This goes to the impartiality of the GM, right? A GM who's not willing to be impartial is not going to be a good GM. And so impartiality, being a referee, being objective and fair, these are very important traits. And if you're wearing the wrong hats, then you're not doing those things. And that was many more people said they would leave a campaign or have left a campaign for that than for the first 3 things. And then we will finish with these guys, and then we'll talk about the 5th and final thing that players said that they would leave a campaign over. One thing I do like is the swarms are weak enough that my my basic attacks pretty much wipe them out. The other thing I've been doing wrong, because I'm talking to you guys, because I wasn't doing this when I was fighting the Devouring Earth without doing a Let's Play, is I keep putting holds on the minions and mind controlling the lieutenants, and that's bad because then they're going to pull out swarms and stuff. I should hold the lieutenants and mind control the minions. Oh, And let's look at the number one is the misunderstanding of the player to GM relationship. And I've talked about this many times. The idea that the GM is not your adversary, but your friend, your collaborator. You're working together. And when the GM doesn't understand that and sees himself more as your adversary, 50% of players said they had quit or would quit a campaign where the GM is acting like the enemy rather than your friend. And that one I completely agree with. And this reminds me of my really good friend, the good Rob, who I always said was the best GM I ever had. My best friend was really good too, but the good Rob was the best. And he once said there are two models of game mastering. One is the GM is your best friend. The other is the GM as angry god. And in this particular case, he was saying we were playing a Neverwinter Nights module made by, just a gamer, a modder, and the modder was being kind of adversarial toward the players of his module. And my best friend said this guy is using the GM as angry god model, right? Instead of the GM as your best friend. And I think that's a really good way to summarize that dichotomy. And it's interesting that in this survey, as many people said they would leave a game with a GM as angry god, right, as all the other complaints combined. Right? This is the biggest problem, and I would actually agree. I think that is the biggest problem. I am very lucky that although, the bad Rob was was breaking the hat wearing rule, even he wasn't, the angry god. We were all friends, and all the GMs I've ever played under in my entire life as a role player, I'm in my 50s now, all of them have gone with the GM as your friend model. None of them were purposely adversarial. Like I say, even the bad Rob, he was wearing the wrong hats when he was running the game, but he wasn't being an adversary, and he was still trying to be our friend. He wasn't trying to be a bad GM, right? He was trying to be a good one. He just wasn't able to separate his intense love for his own characters. He very much fell in love with his characters. He wasn't able to separate that from, the GMing process, and that's what made him a bad GM. Not because he was adversarial. He never really did that, and none of us did, right? We never abused our GMing powers and arbitrarily killed off characters and stuff. We never did that. I never once experienced that. It wasn't just my best friend and the good Rob. We had other DMs, and they always, it was always, I'm your friend and your GM. Always. We are friends and players and GMs, and we're playing together as friends. And I think that that's the most important thing. The GM should be your friend. I completely agree with this one. And I definitely can see why that was the overwhelming majority, right? When you think about the restrictions thing, only about 1 in 11 or 12 players said that would be a deal breaker to nope them out of a campaign. But half of them said the GM as angry god would make me nope out of a campaign. And maybe some of them said, I have. Not only would I, but it's happened. Oh, domination. Put up a hold. Ugh, stupid swarms. And let's get our guys going. And let's get our other guy going. And you can attack anytime now, Hound. So what do you guys think? Go ahead and place, put in the comments, what do you think are the most important of these 5? Do you have others that you would say are your pet peeves? I mean, to me, I would say the biggest pet peeve for me, even beyond, probably the biggest one would be the GM is angry god. Yeah, you don't want to play with a guy like that. But I think one of my biggest pet peeves would just be not doing the work, right? Like a GM who says, yeah, I'll GM, and then they keep canceling out or they don't do prep. We have that happen sometimes where the GM clearly hadn't done prep. And yeah, you can improvise some things. It's really hard to improvise champions because it's very hard to make up villains, and you can't always. Villains are so much more individualized than, say, monsters in a D&D manual that you can't always come up with villains on the fly that are going to be appropriate just by looking in the enemies books. A lot of times you can't, and so it's very hard to run it, to improv adventures and champions. You really kind of have to prepare. You need a map. You need a map that has landmarks and objects on it that can be thrown and broken and all of this. And it's really hard to improv that. And I've seen GMs try, and it almost always bombed. So one of the things that I look for in a GM is somebody willing to do the work, willing to prep, willing to show up week in and week out, or month in and month out, by week in and by week out, however you want to say it. And they always have stuff ready to go, and they're prepped, and they're doing the work for us. And I think that GMs who don't do that are one of my peeves. And that's much worse than restrictions or railroading or any of that, because, well, I mean, if there's no prep, there's going to be a railroad, right? So, I mean, of these things, I think that the restrictions are not an issue for me. The GM can restrict the game however they want, and I am down for it. In fact, I prefer more restrictive games than less restrictive ones, because to me, the restrictions equal the challenge. And it's much more challenging, say, to play a game like ETU, where you have to get into combats without any combat abilities, without any powers, without any weapons, and you still have to somehow win a fight. That is like so cool and much harder to do than winning in Deadlands, a battle in Deadlands, when you can use 6 shooters and magic spells. And I watched an entire series of 4 seasons, Wildcards ETU. I think it's still up on YouTube, and I've watched it twice. It's that good. And I watched them get into battles where one of them had martial arts and none of the others did for like the first 2 seasons. And then eventually one of them learned a little bit of martial arts, but they were never very good at it, except for the guy who was like the football star. And so he had some combat abilities, but like I think they had decided as a group not to go down the combat route, because this made it more challenging and more fun, since their characters were going to be fighting horrors, maybe not ones that are as powerful as in Deadlands, but their characters are going to be fighting horrors, and they're going to have to do it essentially weaponless and skillless in combat. And they had to do tests and support, and everybody, what they did was, as a group, they would set up the martial arts guy so that when he went, he was on a +2 from support, and the enemy was at -2 from being distracted and vulnerable. And they often were able to win battles that way. And it was really tactical and really challenging and really cool and interesting. So I don't mind restrictions at all. I don't mind restrictions at all. If a GM can't admit he's wrong, it's annoying, but it's not going to game break for me. So that's not a game breaker for me. Railroading is not going to be a game breaker for me. The wrong hat problem, I agree with the top two, and that's 70% of people said this is why they would leave a game. The wrong hat problem, where the GM's wearing multiple hats, can be extremely unpleasant, and I've seen it. That was the bad Rob, and no, I probably wouldn't want to play in a campaign like that. But the biggest one is the GM has to be your friend. If he's going to be adversarial, I'm out. That's mine. What are yours? Which ones of these 5 do you think are the biggest issues? And if you think of something else, like I just talked about, which is like prep and being there for it and doing the work, right? And not doing the work. If you can think of another one, go ahead and let me know what that is, and we'll keep going in the comments. One last thing I do want to mention is I was watching a guy who's got a big following on YouTube, and he said that he was talking about comments, and he said, "I know not to read the comments. I never read the comments in my videos." I have moderators for that, but I don't read the comments. I know better than to read the comments. And I thought, wow, what a different world, right? He's got millions of subscribers and probably thousands of haters, and lots of people leave hateful comments, I'm sure. But I've been actually really lucky on this channel that most of what we've had is a real high quality back and forth. So please feel free to leave comments. I do read them all, as most of you've seen. Sometimes I miss them. Sometimes YouTube doesn't tell me I have a comment. And I go in months later and find out, oh my gosh, somebody left a comment and I didn't see it. I feel terrible when that happens. So it's never on purpose, guys. Never. I check my comments at least several times a week and sometimes every day. But I go into the comments interface in YouTube. I don't look at the individual videos because there's too many videos. So I just go to the section that's got the summary of all the comments and I look to see, are there any that I haven't answered? And sometimes it doesn't show me any for like 2 weeks. And then it'll show me ones that go back during those 2 weeks that it hadn't shown me. And I'm like, how is that? Or I'll go to the video and I see 2 comments and I'm like, those happened in the last week, but YouTube hasn't been showing them to me. So it's never intentional, guys. Never. I answer. I don't get that many, so I answer my comments. I do want to make one other channel update. I've recorded a lot more ARC videos, but I don't think I'm going to post any because nobody's really commenting on them or watching them or liking them, and I don't need that, right? This isn't a vanity project. If people don't want to watch them, that's fine, but it's like easier for me not to upload them if people don't want to watch. It seems like they don't, so I'm just not going to upload. I'm still playing it. My character's like level 70, but I don't feel like there's any need to upload. So I will say this: if anybody's watching them and wants them to continue, you better post a comment somewhere just to tell me that, or I'm going to start deleting those videos. And I mean that's fine, but just if you want to watch them, you better tell me before I delete them. So I'll leave them up for a few weeks after the posting of this video, just in case I don't see comments for a little while. But after, I would say by Thanksgiving, it's currently now 20th or so of October, 22nd of October. By Thanksgiving, if I don't see any comments about, and there's no watches of those for initial ARC videos, I'm just going to delete those others from my hard drive because I need the space. It's fine, but just, let me know if you want me to keep them. Otherwise, they're just going to go, right? This is the end of our 32nd episode for this, our level 32 episode for this character. We've got 18 episodes to go, and then we will hit level 50, and that will probably be the end of this series. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes.